There is a version of aging that looks like disappearance, and a version that looks like this. He's 50-something, forearms still carrying old ink, gone slightly green at the edges, and nothing about his posture asks for approval. I notice the difference before I can name it because the body in front of me is not performing youth, and it is not performing decline either. He moves like someone who made peace with a shape decades ago and simply kept living inside it. You have seen this too somewhere, a man or woman at a gas station or a grocery store, denim jacket, patch-covered, unhurried, unbothered by your glance. Something about that unbothered quality is the actual subject here, more than the leather or the hairline. Most aging bodies in this culture are narrated as failures to maintain a younger one, a slow leak that better habits are supposed to plug. His body is not narrated that way, by him or by anyone watching, and that absence of narrative is doing something structural. I keep returning to this instead of moving past it because the calm is not incidental, it is load-bearing. A person cannot fake this particular stillness, the kind that has already absorbed 40 years of being told the wrong thing. Anger management culture had a version of masculinity to correct. Softness culture had a version to replace it, and he simply kept his. I want to know what a psychology has to look like in order to stay this coherent for this long without external tuning. That question does not resolve by looking harder at him individually, because he is not an anomaly, he is a pattern with a birth year. Nothing in his file explains him, and everything in the decade that made him does. The world he was handed did not offer stability, so whatever stability he has now was built, not inherited, and building leaves different residue than inheriting. Latchkey afternoons taught a specific competence, the competence of not needing someone to walk in and manage the situation. Economic contraction in early adulthood taught another one, the competence of expecting less and therefore not being destabilized by getting less. Analog culture gave him full albums instead of algorithmic fragments, 40 minutes of sustained attention before the next dopamine reset was due. Labor conditions were already eroding trust in institutions before he ever cast a vote, so distrust arrived as baseline, not injury. Emotional culture at the time offered almost no vocabulary for internal states, which sounds like a deficit until you watch what filled the gap instead. Music filled it, loud and structured and repeatable, offering regulation without requiring the language that therapy would later insist on. None of these conditions alone explains the calm, but together they describe a nervous system trained by scarcity rather than exposed by it. There is no single adaptation mechanism running here. There are several, operating on different clocks, occasionally contradicting each other, mostly reinforcing. What I am actually looking at is layered, and each layer only becomes visible once the one above it stops being a sufficient explanation. The visible behavior is the first layer, and it is the easiest one to misread as mere aesthetic loyalty. Layer 1 holds the pattern anyone can observe, the surface where a stranger's assumptions form before any deeper mechanism gets considered. He still goes to shows, standing near the back, arms crossed, nodding at a tempo change only a small percentage of the room even registers. He owns the same coat he owned decades ago, patches added over time like geological strata, never replaced, never fully current. You recognize the type instantly, and your recognition is doing real cognitive work, sorting him into a category before any word gets exchanged.
That instant sorting is not incidental because identity signaling this stable is unusual enough to register as information on first glance. What makes this pattern repeat for so long when every other subculture around him got absorbed, diluted, or discarded? Repetition at this scale is never accidental. It is maintained by something operating beneath the visible choice of clothing or set list. The mechanism underneath is ritual, specifically ritual that regulates arousal rather than merely expressing preference. Volume, rhythm, physical density in a crowd all function as a nervous system technology, not as decoration. He is not attending a concert the way a tourist attends an event. He is running a maintenance cycle his body has trusted for 40 years. Cortisol responds to predictable intensity differently than to unpredictable intensity, and a mosh pit is, paradoxically, one of the most predictable environments he has. The genre's structure, tension and release repeated across a song, mirrors a stress response cycle that his generation was rarely taught any other way to complete. Most people his age never learned formal affect regulation, so an inherited ritual quietly did the job instead, session after session, decade after decade. A mechanism only earns this kind of authority through repetition, and repetition is precisely what turns a coping tool into an identity. What happens to a coping mechanism once it has been run thousands of times without ever being named as one? It stops being a tool and becomes a trait, indistinguishable from the outside from personality itself. This is the accumulation layer, where the mechanism disappears into character, and character is mistaken for something a person was simply born with. He does not think of the show as regulation anymore. He thinks of it as who he is, and that collapse of category is the tell. 30 years of the same regulatory ritual does not produce someone who copes well. It produces someone who no longer registers the coping as effort. That is a significant distinction because effortless regulation reads to observers as temperament when it is closer to trained infrastructure. His baseline arousal threshold has likely shifted over decades of exposure, meaning what destabilizes other people barely registers on his internal scale anymore. This is not resilience in the popular motivational sense. It is closer to habituation, dense and specific, built one loud night at a time. You could call it desensitization and not be wrong, though the word carries a judgment the mechanism itself does not deserve. What accumulates is not just tolerance for volume, it is tolerance for chaos generally, since the ritual always resolved even when it looked uncontrolled. 40 years of watching apparent chaos resolve into order, night after night, teaches a nervous system something no seminar could install as quickly. But accumulation this dense rarely arrives without a cost, and the cost here is easy to miss because it looks like nothing at all. The cost hides precisely where the mechanism succeeds, because success this consistent removes the incentive to ever develop an alternative. He may have never built a verbal vocabulary for distress because the ritual metabolized distress before language was ever required to intervene. That absence is not visible in him directly, it is visible in what does not happen, the conversation that never gets initiated. Ask him what he felt during a hard year, and the ritual's name might come up before any actual feeling gets described. A regulation system this efficient can quietly replace insight, since the nervous system resolves the tension before the mind is asked to interpret it. This is not pathology. Most people carry an equivalent trait somewhere, but this particular trait is unusually well hidden by how functional it looks. The hidden cost is invisibility itself, a coping system so well integrated that neither he nor anyone around him can locate it as one. That invisibility, though, is exactly what creates the next boundary, because a hidden cost still shapes everything built on top of it.
If insight was partially outsourced to ritual for this long, what does that outsourcing do to the sense of self built on top of it? That question does not belong to this layer anymore. It belongs to the one where behavior stops being habit and starts being identity. This is not the deepest layer, but it is where the pattern stops being something he does and becomes something he is, which changes the stakes considerably. Identity built on ritual rather than narrative is unusually resistant to erosion because there is no story competing to replace it. His sense of self was never dependent on a coherent life story the way many identities are, since the ritual supplied continuity instead of the story. You can strip a narrative-based identity by disputing the narrative, but there is very little narrative here left to dispute. Ask him who he is, and the answer routes through behavior and object, the coat, the shows, the years, rather than through a plot line about himself. That is unusual, because most adults construct identity primarily through narrative, a story about who they were and what it meant. A narrative-based self is vulnerable in a specific way, since narratives can be reinterpreted, undermined, or simply outgrown under new information. A ritual-based self sidesteps that vulnerability almost entirely, because the ritual does not require reinterpretation to keep functioning as an anchor. This is likely one reason identity crises, common in midlife, appear less frequently or less visibly in people whose identity was never story-shaped to begin with. There was no midlife story to suddenly find false, because the anchor point was never a story, it was Tuesday nights, loud rooms, familiar riffs. Stability of this kind is rare enough that it deserves scrutiny rather than admiration, since every stable structure eventually gets tested by an obligation. Identity that skips narrative construction also skips narrative obligation, and obligation is where the next layer becomes unavoidable. An identity this stable inevitably interacts with other people, and other people bring demands the ritual alone was never built to answer. Responsibility introduces a category the previous layers barely touched, because ritual regulates the self, but obligation regulates the self in relation to others. He raised something, a child, a career, a household, using a regulatory system built almost entirely for private use. The pattern shows up in how conflict gets handled, since the instinct to metabolize tension through ritual does not disappear just because the tension is now shared. He may retreat toward volume or solitary ritual when a relational conflict actually calls for shared vocabulary, and the mismatch is not always visible to him. You have likely watched a version of this. Someone who's calm under personal pressure becomes distance under relational pressure, without any clear villain in the room. The same mechanism that regulates him privately may underdeliver exactly where mutual regulation, not private regulation, is what the situation requires. This is not a flaw unique to him. It is a structural mismatch between a coping system built for one person and a life that eventually included others. Whether that mismatch produced friction or was simply absorbed by patient people around him is a detail this analysis cannot access from the outside. What can be said is that responsibility tests every prior layer simultaneously, exposing whichever one was least prepared for a second person's needs. That exposure does not stay contained to one relationship, because a pattern tested once tends to repeat across every relationship it touches next. Relationships are where private regulation either translates into shared regulation or quietly fails to, and that failure or success shapes everything that follows. If the ritual metabolized his distress alone for decades, what happens when someone close to him needs to be metabolized alongside him, not instead of him? That is not a question this layer answers. It is a question the next layer was built to hold. Every long relationship eventually asks whether its stability was mutual or merely tolerated, and tolerance is easy to mistake for partnership from a distance. He may have partners, friends, bandmates who absorbed the parts of him the ritual never had to touch, quietly filling a gap he could not see. That is invisible labor, performed by whoever stood close enough, and its invisibility does not make it smaller, it makes it harder to credit. You rarely see this layer directly, because it lives in other people's patience rather than in his own visible behavior. A subculture that emphasizes loyalty, brotherhood, shared ritual, effectively distributes emotional labor across a community instead of concentrating it inside one household. That distribution is likely one reason this population reports less isolation than comparable peers, since the tribe absorbed what the individual regulation system could not. Community here is not decorative either. It functions the way an extended nervous system functions, offloading regulation to more nodes than one person alone. He does not need a single person to hold everything, because 40 years of shared ritual built him several people who each hold a portion.
That distributed structure is resilient in exactly the way concentrated structures are not, since no single relationship failing collapses the entire regulatory system. But distributed structures have their own blind spot, since diffuse support can mask the absence of any one deep, specific, examined bond. Wide support is not the same as deep support, and it is worth asking which one his relationships were actually optimized to provide. That question about depth points somewhere his relationships alone cannot answer, toward whether any of this ever needed to mean something beyond function. Meaning is a different register than regulation or relationship, since something can work perfectly and still leave the question of purpose completely untouched. He may never ask whether any of this meant something, precisely because it worked so well that the question never became urgent. You could call that peace, or you could call it a question deferred so successfully it started to resemble an answer. Functionality this total can quietly stand in for meaning, the way a machine running smoothly stops inviting inspection of what it was built for. His stability might not come from having resolved the question of meaning. It might come from a system efficient enough to make the question optional. That is a very different kind of peace than the peace usually described in stories about people who found their purpose. This one was never found, it was simply never required, and that absence of requirement is its own psychological event, not a neutral fact. A life can run for decades on regulation and community alone, meaning present only as an unexamined byproduct rather than a chosen destination. Whether that constitutes a full life or a well-defended one depends on a standard this layer alone cannot supply. What can be said is that unexamined meaning behaves differently under pressure than examined meaning, since one has been tested and the other has not. That difference in testing is not visible in ordinary conditions. It only becomes visible when the surrounding structure itself gets threatened. There is one more place to look, past his individual case, at what an entire generation avoided seeing about itself by building this so well. If millions of people ran the same regulation, distributed the same labor, deferred the same meaning question, that scale changes what is actually being described. This stops being one man's psychology and becomes a collective pattern, and collective patterns carry their own kind of unexamined territory. The blind spot is not his alone. It belongs to an entire cohort that solved private distress so effectively it rarely had to become public conversation. A generation that regulated itself through ritual instead of institutions built real strength and also quietly under-tested whether those institutions needed to be pressured to change. You could frame the calm as wisdom, and it partly is, but calm this widespread also functioned as a very effective form of collective avoidance. Nothing was demanded loudly, because loud demands were unnecessary when private ritual absorbed what public reform might otherwise have been forced to address. That is the seventh layer, the point where individual coping becomes indistinguishable from a generation's decision not to ask certain harder questions out loud. No tier operated alone through any of this, and none of them explain him or his cohort in isolation from the others. Behavior was never separable from mechanism, mechanism was never separable from accumulation, and accumulation was never separable from what it quietly cost. Identity, responsibility, relationship, meaning, all fed each other continuously, each one both a product and a cause of the layer beside it. Remove any single layer and the entire structure reads differently, since none of them were ever actually independent variables to begin with. He is still just a man standing near the back of a room,
arms crossed, present rather than performing, unbothered in a way that took decades to earn. You may have started this recognizing only the coat or the calm or the patch-covered denim without expecting any of what sits underneath it. What once looked like a personal experience turns out to be one instance of a much larger structural pattern operating across an entire cohort. The investigation stops here, at the point of recognizing the structure, not at the point of resolving what to do about it. There is another psychological pattern sitting just past this one, still unnamed, still visible in ordinary rooms if anyone bothers to actually look. He has not been fully explained yet, no one this specific ever is, and that incompleteness is not a flaw in the analysis. You are invited to keep watching for it, not to find an answer, only to continue the same kind of noticing this one required. Thank you for staying with this entire investigation from its first unnamed state through to its final layer. Tell us which layer felt the most familiar to you, the ritual, the identity, the relationship, or the meaning quietly deferred. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to keep tracing patterns like this one, calmly, one layer at a time.